To those of you who received honors, awards, and distinctions, I say well done. And to the C students, I say you too can be President of the United States.
We have the worst president in America's history. He's ignorant, he's arrogant, he's stupid in all ways but one, which is he's immensely shrewd about the American people, particularly the less intelligent half of America, because they're very happy with him in that they realize how stupid he is, and they say to themselves, wonderful, if that stupid guy can be president, so can I.
We have elected a puppet for a president. Actually, we didn't elect him. He was appointed. His brother Jeb stole 50,000 votes in Florida, and his father's Supreme Court appointed him.
You know, if God has spoken to you and said you're going to be president, you don't have to worry about court decisions or recounts or things like that. All right, so he became president, but he didn't know why. And on September 11th, he discovered why.
This is my last stop on the way to Washington to serve as your president. I'm excited about the work. I'll come back to see you soon. God bless.
In January 2001, George W. Bush left his native Texas for Washington. He had just won the most controversial and muddled election in American political history. Eight years after his father, George Bush Sr., George W. became leader of the most powerful nation on earth. This was an unprecedented event in American history. All the major events of the last 12 years have taken place under a Bush presidency. The collapse of the Soviet Empire and the Communist bloc, the first Gulf War, the events of 9/11, the worldwide spread of terrorism, and the Second War with Iraq.
They can pray for me, they can pray for my little girls, they can pray for my wife, they can pray for our family.
Let's do that. Let's do that together even now for this leader and all of them. Father, we ask you to bless our leaders, to direct our leaders, to redirect when necessary our leaders, to correct our leaders, to comfort them, to protect them and their families. God, we ask you to not only fill their hearts with love, but let them feel love from our heart toward them. I pray that this leader, our Governor Bush, will be one who never looks for the opportunity to strike out at someone, but rather to make a mark for good and a mark for right. Bless him and his family and protect him. In Jesus' name.
When he was asked in one of the presidential debates who he admired most as a philosopher or someone in history, he said Jesus Christ. He said it because he does admire his character, his principles, the practice of his life. He really had an encounter with God. He did acknowledge that he had battled with perhaps excessive alcohol and drinking. He not for a moment ever implied to me or publicly that he was an alcoholic, but he told me that it was a problem. And he said that faith and his relationship with God had changed his life.
He's the spoiled child of a rich family. And while he was growing up, he had an awful lot of fun. A lot of parties, a lot of girls, a lot of alcohol, normal story. At a certain point, he had a religious experience. God spoke to him and said, prepare yourself, I have a mission for you. And he stopped drinking. And he stopped philandering.
He considers he turned himself around because of religion. And he deals with a lot of very conservative people. And they truly believe that they're right.
In an interview with an Austin newspaper, George W. declared, "I'm invested with a divine mission to promote a biblical worldview in the policy carried out by the USA." David Frum, Bush's speechwriter, witnessed the president in the Oval Office telling members of Protestant congregations how God had saved him from booze.
He said, you know, I shouldn't be here. I should be on a bar stool in Texas, and I'm only here because of the power of prayer, because I found God.
The religiosity has a genuine quality to it. It has affected his life. He does feel it in a deep way. And a lot of born-again Christians who have met with Bush come away believing he is like them. He is them.
Everybody prays the first thing in the morning. They're believers. They're believers. And they pray in the White House.
Bush declared during his campaign that heaven is open only to those who accept Jesus Christ. John Ashcroft, his Attorney General, proclaimed, "We have no king but Jesus." At the White House, cabinet meetings took on an air of prayer meetings where, in between readings from the Old and New Testaments, those in the room managed the affairs of America and the world.
When I entered the West Wing, the very first thing I heard said was, "You were missed at Bible study." Because they would have, the evangelicals had a weekly Bible study, they had Christian fellowship. And the religion was very important to that staff and very important to that presidency.
I think Bush overdoes the religious aspect. It makes me uneasy, and I think it makes many Americans uneasy.
It is not true that George Bush goes down on his knees and asks God, "What should I do?" The idea that God gives him every morning an agenda, no, George Bush does not think like that. But he finds his source of strength in a religious faith.
I mean, this administration kowtows to religion, to extreme religion.
Bush's strongest, his base, his strong base, is the religious, conservative right wing.
Ed McAteer, who lives in Memphis, is a Christian Zionist. He withdrew his support from George W. because he rejects Dick Cheney as a suitable vice president. His reasoning is quite surprising.
Bush says that he's against homosexuality, yet he picked a vice president whose daughter is a lesbian. Now, I tell people, I said, I'm not blaming the father for that, but George Bush knew that when he picked him, and so during the Republican convention that was played over and over, that lesbian girl, and she's seen all over the country, people know that.
All of this is disturbing to many people, but it happens to be a fact that the president is part of the Christian right.
The founder of the Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell, blamed pagans, gays, and lesbians, according to him, responsible for the September 11th attacks. Bush declared, "Let us ask for God's wisdom and presence in what we're undertaking. This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while."
The Christian right has its own foreign policy. Support for Israel because they know how to fight, and also because there's a distinct anti-Muslim bent among these people.
We had Boykin, General Boykin, who is now head of intelligence at the Pentagon, who was preaching in his uniform like a born-again Christian on a crusade against Islam. General Boykin and the president think the same way.
It's not Osama bin Laden. It's not what you can see. It's the enemy in the spiritual realm.
I mean, we've got Boykin showing people slides over Mogadishu back when the Black Hawk Down incident occurred, saying that here in the slide, that's the devil you're seeing, that's Satan flying over.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's not a fake. Whether you understand it or not, it is a demonic spirit.
What it was a Predator aircraft taking pictures. But he tells people that. This is head of U.S. intelligence. So, in the Pentagon. I mean, what do you say to that?
They believe in God, and they believe in a mission. They believe in a crusade against evil.
I think Muhammad was a terrorist. I read enough of the history of his life, written by both Muslims and non-Muslims, that he was a violent man, a man of war.
If we are in harmony with God, then we should love people. If Islam is in contact with some spiritual force, as they claim to be, would that spiritual force want to annihilate everyone that disagreed with them? Well, that would be another Hitler, a white supremacist. I mean, this is terrible thought.
I don't hate the Arab people. I got Arab friends. I love them. But I'm a Bible believer. And see, God gave that land to Abraham, to the Jew. And I use a little cliche saying that every grain of sand on that little piece of geography called Israel belongs to the Jewish people.
Up to 60 million people that identify themselves with the Christian right believe that the state of Israel must exist at the end of history. And that's how we're all going to go to heaven. If it doesn't exist, if it's overrun by Muslims, we're going to go to hell.
This could be a gathering in Jerusalem, but we are in fact in deepest Colorado. None of the participants is Jewish, neither on stage nor in the audience. This is the annual Congress of the Christian Coalition of America. Thousands of people gather in this huge amphitheater to acclaim the State of Israel.
United States of America.
They come to Jerusalem to demonstrate their support for Israel, simply because they believe it's a step towards the ultimate victory of Christianity, since the Jews are considered spiritually blind for their rejection of Jesus. After a final battle between good and evil, many Jews will convert to Christianity, and non-believers will be damned and perish.
They are the most unrestrained, total supporters of Israel that you can find in the world. There's a much higher percentage of American Christian evangelicals that support Israel than of American Jews, believe me.
You have an alliance in the United States, which is a very important alliance. It's not on paper, it's a de facto alliance between the Christian right and the Israeli lobby. There's a direct alliance there, and it's a rather unusual alliance, the first time I've seen it in my lifetime.
Ariel Sharon's appearances before the Christian Zionists provoke rapturous ovations of the kind generally given to rock stars. For them, Sharon has been chosen by God to accomplish the prophecies relating to the end of time.
With God's help and your solidarity, we will win. We will win.
Prime Minister Sharon has been received 9 times by President Bush for private meetings, which is more than any other leader in the world.
Welcome, Mr. Prime Minister. Glad you're here.
The only way to understand American foreign policy in the Middle East is to understand that Israel is an integral part of the American body politic. And just taking it one step further, to explain to Arabs how they can possibly relate to what we're doing in the Middle East, is to think of Israel as the 51st American state. As a matter of fact, we treat Israel better than we treat most American states.
But it's from the neoconservatives in Washington that the Israeli right wing derives its staunchest support. A small group of intellectuals, journalists, and researchers has penetrated the apparatus of America's power. Paul Wolfowitz, Under-Secretary of State for Defense, is their leader. Since George W. took up residence in the White House, they have set the political agenda in Washington. The neocons are pulling all the strings.
I don't believe they see any contradiction in that. What's good for Israel, or rather for the Israeli right, is good for the USA and vice versa.
Paul Wolfowitz is a man who found a champion or a cause in Israel and in neoconservatism, and he knows nothing else. And therefore, his personal satisfaction and glorification is wrapped up in abusing American power.
In 1998, the Committee for Peace and Security in the Gulf sent an open letter to the president urging military intervention in Iraq. The letter concluded with these words: "Let's make this quite clear. The overthrow of Saddam is overwhelmingly in the national interest." Among the signatories of the letter were Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl.
They're either at the Pentagon with Wolfowitz or around Cheney. And that makes for a very tight-knit little team.
It's a mistake to lump together as one view Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl. Richard Pearl has his own views that he's exercised outside the government.
Paul is, of course, an extremely important official as Deputy Secretary of Defense. Richard is merely a private citizen who occasionally gives advice through various advisory boards.
Richard Pearl is a conniving, self-serving individual who has manipulated personal relationships into a position of undue power. I think he is one of the 3 most dangerous people in the United States.
Richard Pearl, one of the most prominent of Washington's neocons, is here on vacation in his villa in Provence, southern France. Although he has no official function, Pearl has at his disposal an office in the Pentagon, near Donald Rumsfeld. He also enjoys clearance providing direct access to confidential and top-secret information. The New Yorker wrote, "Pearl wants power and influence. He's living everybody's dream here in Washington, to participate in policymaking and never be accountable." The American press, which nicknames Pearl the Prince of Darkness because of his fondness for secret backstage maneuvers, describes him as an agitator, uncontrollable. He plays an essential role next to the president.
Oh, no, not at all. I'm sometimes amused to see stories about how influential I am in the White House. I have not seen President Bush since the day he took office.
We may have influence of a certain sort. We may help people understand the world, but we certainly don't have any direct effect on making policy.
I don't understand why this is such a mystery to so many people. It's portrayed as a conspiracy. It's nothing of the sort.
The people around Bush are not stupid. They're very smart. They are very calculating and manipulative. They're not deaf or dumb in any sense of the word. And Bush is not blind as much as he's inattentive.
I don't think he understands the situation. I don't think he understands the history. I think it would require, he's a uniquely incurious man.
I don't think he reads a lot, but I think he talks a lot to people, and he depends a great deal on what people tell him for his information.
He is a quick learner. He is able to find out which people have the knowledge that I need, and then he uses them.
He soaks up information like a sponge. And he is willing to ask questions, or was then willing to ask questions, that made it very clear there was a lot he didn't know, but he wanted to know.
I just don't think that Bush 43 is a geopolitical thinker. He doesn't know too much about the world, which is not his fault. He simply did not travel.
I mean, Bush didn't have a passport until he became president. How in God's name can he know about foreign policy or foreign countries? He didn't visit any foreign countries. He knows Texas, he knows Maine, where he takes vacation with his father, and then he has these people who are friends with the family.
The people who are the core of his staff in the White House were the people who were the core of his staff in Texas, and this is very unusual. He spent 6 years with these people in Texas, watching how they all got along with one another. And it was in Texas, where the national media were not watching, where whatever fights people had, they had them back in 1995 and 1996.
So Bush does surround himself, as I say, with these very sharp, intelligent people. And to a great extent, then, of course, they manipulate him.
Richard Pearl, Doug Feith, Bernard Lewis, the academic, Wolfowitz, all of them come in there and they say, this is the way the world is. I mean, how would you ever know?
It's not that we are an influence on the president. It's that the president's own thinking is rather similar to ours.
The neoconservatives aren't really interested in domestic policy. They're concerned about America's power, the role of America in the world.
If one is a hawk because of a readiness to use force when it is the only thing that has any reasonable chance of success, then okay, I am guilty as charged.
We are obliged, within the limits of our capacities, within the context of sort of reasonable possibility, to support democratic revolution everywhere, always. That's what we are.
They believe that they brought down the Soviet Union, okay? They really believe it. Richard Pearl, Wolfowitz, everybody at the Reagan administration, they believe they took the place down. And so they're saying, well, if we can do it in the Soviet Union, why not bring down all these evil empires in the Middle East? They're very clear about this. They were talking about it's time to reform the Middle East. And one of the things they wanted to do was crush Saddam Hussein for the benefit of Israel.
Il y avait par-dessus le marché
On top of this, there was a dream of transforming the whole Middle East so that the people hostile to the USA and to the West would be eliminated.
And Iraq was the country for which we were best prepared because we had been at war with Iraq since 1990. And we had military options, and we thought we knew a lot about the country, and we were prepared to do that.
All they were doing was they needed a pretext. That's all they needed.
Until September 11th, George W. Bush had no program. September 11th comes and imposes on him a mission.
A disaster occurred, and at the same time, it was extremely useful for the administration. Because when September 11th happened, the Bush team had been in office for around 9 months and wasn't getting anywhere.
9/11 defined his presidency. 9/11 is the day on which he discovered who he was and what he had to do.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. I have a message for our military. Be ready. I've called the armed forces to alert, and there is a reason. The hour is coming when America will act, and you will make us proud. May God grant us wisdom, and may He watch over the United States of America. Thank you.
If President Bush had come to Congress on the 20th of September 2001 and said, I am here today to talk about these terrorist attacks, and I think we must re-examine the faults in our own foreign policy that have brought us to this position. And while we will certainly do our best to arrest the people who did these terrible deeds, we must also remember that we have a work of conciliation and appeasement to do in the Middle East, and above all, we must settle the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. If he had said that to Congress and the American people, they would have impeached him. He wouldn't have gotten out of the room alive.
The day after 9/11, certain members of the administration based in and around the Pentagon went to see the vice president saying, now's the time to get rid of Saddam Hussein.
They made a decision on 9/11 that this was the excuse they needed to go in and finish up Saddam Hussein.
That was the plan. And this administration was indeed waiting for a pretext. General Clark has said publicly that on 9/11, as American couples were holding hands and jumping to their death, the White House called him and said, pin it on a rock. They weren't thinking about the Americans dying. They weren't thinking about the people who were committing suicide in order to escape the flames. They were thinking about 9/11 not as an attack, but as a gift.
Do it. They had the opportunity. And linking Al-Qaeda and Hussein was a lie, but that isn't what they wanted to do.
It was Vice President Dick Cheney who convinced George W. of the necessity of military action against Iraq. He'd adopted exactly the same attitude as Secretary of Defense 12 years earlier during the first Gulf crisis. Paul Wolfowitz was equally persuasive with Donald Rumsfeld, the current Secretary of Defense. He secured the post of Deputy Secretary of Defense to keep tabs on Colin Powell, as he said to Rumsfeld. On September 17th, the whole team gathered at the President's ranch to plot the overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
There was discussion about Iraq right after September 11. I don't believe a decision was made at that point.
Paul Wolfowitz started talking up Iraq. Iraq is the real culprit. Well, I mean, how can Bush decide whether it's the real culprit or not? If Paul Wolfowitz tells him that it is, you trust Paul Wolfowitz.
I think the inclination was there with Cheney. I think it is very clear Paul Wolfowitz pushed every opportunity he had to suggest that we should engage in regime change.
It's quite true that Wolfowitz was for invading Iraq very early.
There may be circumstances in which we know that we are about to be attacked, and in those circumstances, if we can prevent that attack by striking first, of course we should do that. It's perfectly normal.
If they'd come to the American people and said, look, we want to engage in a war of conquest, in effect, to reestablish the balance politically in the Middle East, I don't think people would have gone along with it.
The president basically has let the public believe a lie, which is that Iraq played a role in 9/11, which is nonsense.
But he's done that entirely on his own. It's not that he's been unduly influenced by a small group of people.
Believe me, the people who perpetuated this lie, the neoconservatives around Bush and the others, knew all that. They knew what effect it was having on the public.
I think what September 11th showed is if 19 people using nothing more than conventional airliners can kill 3,000 people in one day, and we start to look at the weapons that those people were exploring even on September 11th, and the potential for groups like that ultimately to inflict not 3,000 in one day, not 30,000, but 300,000 or maybe 3 million. Then you realize this is not an evil we can continue to live with. It's an evil that has to be eradicated.
Read the speeches by Mr. Bush, Mr. Cheney, and Mr. Rumsfeld throughout the period prior to the war in Iraq, after September 11th. It's very subtle. They begin by referring to Saddam Hussein, then to September 11th, and finally to bin Laden. They never link them in an explicit manner, but if someone listens with only half an ear, three notions mingle and blend, sowing the seeds of the idea in the American people's minds that there's a link between these three figures and events. The president spoke several times about the ties between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. 18 journalists asked questions. One about the president's relationship with God, and all the others about Iraq. Not one of them raised the issue of the ties between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. They had swallowed it completely.
I've never believed that from the very beginning. Why would Saddam Hussein risk being involved with Al-Qaeda? He has no record of trusting terrorist groups. He's played with them, but dictators in the Middle East don't trust terrorist groups.
I don't see how you could deny it. And you know, for Richard Pearl, here's this guy, I was on TV with him. He said this in public. That bastard Saddam Hussein was responsible for September 11th. When he knew very well that there was no basis for this story. And started this myth about Saddam being behind September 11th. There's just no evidence.
In late December, President Bush asked David Frum to pen his State of the Union address. He needed to strike public opinion by finding the equivalent of Ronald Reagan's famous sobriquet for the Soviet Union, the evil empire.
In that original draft, the phrase was axis of hatred. But writing for the President of the United States is very much like writing for a major Hollywood film production. You write your words, and then they go into a gigantic bureaucratic process, and you revise and you work with others. He's like a character in a movie, and you think of him that way. What would George Bush say about this? And you try to absorb the way he thinks, the way he communicates, his values, his feelings, so that you can answer for him what he would say if he had the time. And I was asked, if the president wants to take the war beyond Afghanistan, how would he explain to the American people why he is doing what he is doing? Could you come up with an example of how we could speak? So I wrote a section, like a page or two, on that question. And my material then became the basis of the section of the speech that dealt with Iraq.
Our war against terror is only beginning. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. The price of indifference would be catastrophic.
And it really rested on one principle, that Saddam Hussein possessed real, significant weapons of mass destruction now, today. Not that he was building them, not that he wanted them in the future, not that he had them in the past. It was that he had them today.
We know that Saddam built weapons of mass destruction. He used them. And we know that he refused to explain what had happened to them.
These people came to their conclusions and then looked for intelligence to support it. And when they couldn't find intelligence to support it, they created lies to the American public, to the American Congress, to the United Nations, and to the rest of the world. They lied to the world.
For 18 months, the government proclaimed the same idea at every opportunity. The apocalypse was at hand.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
Our enemies have declared this very intention and have been caught seeking these terrible weapons.
We're talking about anthrax. We're talking about botulinum toxin. We're talking about nuclear weapons programs.
It clearly would be unhelpful if terrorists got their hands on some of Iraq's chemical or biological capabilities.
It is a shell game played on a grand scale with deadly serious weapons.
Is trying to shake the will of America and the civilized world. And this country will not be intimidated.
What he wants is time, and more time, to husband his resources, to invest in his ongoing chemical and biological weapons program, and to gain possession of nuclear weapons.
The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
C'est ça qui est inquiétant, de voir avec quelle facilité.
The disturbing thing is to see how well-organized and repetitive propaganda, driving the point home into people's minds, can be so effective.
This administration has chosen to use the propaganda tools of Hitler and Goering and Goebbels.
We're not living under a Nazi regime, but even so, when Goebbels said that if you repeat a lie often enough, people swallow it, he wasn't wrong. And that's what we saw happen at that time.
We have to scare the hell out of the people of the United States. I think Bush and Cheney, and I don't approve of this, I think Bush and Cheney were engaged in scaring the people, trying to unite public opinion.
This was necessary for him to convince the public that this was an issue, this was a problem, this was a threat that had to be dealt with immediately. And there was no time to try any other alternative courses of action.
Over the years, we've tried limited strikes against military facilities. It didn't work. We've offered Iraq the path of voluntary disarmament and inspections. The Iraqi regime is rejecting it.
He said the UN inspectors had concluded that there were massive stockpiles of weapons, of chemical weapons and biological weapons. Now the problem with all this is there was no evidence to back it up. The UN inspectors never said that.
The White House's strategy set out two specific stages. The first stage was to get rid of the UN weapons inspectors, who persisted in finding no evidence of weapons of mass destruction and in saying so. The second stage was to prove that the WMDs did exist. Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld concentrated their efforts on discrediting Hans Blix, the head of the UN's Arms Control Committee. Dragged through the mud by the Bush administration, Blix became the White House's pet peeve. Eventually, he gave up and went home to Stockholm. Before his departure, however, in an interview with The Guardian in highly undiplomatic terms, he launched a counterattack. I was smeared by the Pentagon, who spread things around, who planted nasty things in the media. Those bastards pursued me for 3 years.
Perhaps I had not really thought that that particular word
was as strong in American English as it was. I had heard it many times in my student days in England and didn't think it was so hard. But maybe I should have used another word. Maybe I should have said skunk.
I think the drivers of this are at the top levels of the Defense Department, people like the hawks like Wolfowitz. I mean, these are people who in whose interest it was to see Blix discredited.
There was a fairly severe, you might say, smear campaign by media.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
The London Times had an article in which their New York correspondent suggested that I should turn the smoking gun on my own head.
It's revolting. Revolting because he's a man of great integrity.
They did so for a reason, I suppose, and that was that they felt they might not have convinced their constituents, their parliaments, or the Congress to go to war simply by saying that we suspect. That would not have been enough.
If Americans believed Blix, we wouldn't have gone to war when we did. So Americans had to not believe Blix.
They probably had many other reasons too why they wanted to go for Saddam. Mr. Wolfowitz has said that the choice of weapons of mass destruction as a reason was a bureaucratic one, that this was one that everybody could agree on. It was a hyping, I think. It was a spin. It was very hard to see that the Iraqis were terribly dangerous in the year 2002 and 2003. The vice president gave some speeches in August of 2002 in which he did not conceal that he thought inspections were useless at the best. And I think Mr. Wolfowitz was of the same view.
Now, Colin Powell, who is supposed to be the smart one in this administration, is the one, I remind everybody, who stood up before the United Nations and claimed there are weapons of mass destruction.
Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters.
He had gone through the evidence, so he took responsibility for what he said. And it's quite clear that not all of what he said there really held water.
How much longer are we willing to put up with Iraq's noncompliance before we, as a council, we as the United Nations say, enough, enough? Saddam Hussein and his regime are busy doing all they possibly can to ensure that inspectors succeed in finding absolutely nothing.
It's a little like the witch hunting in the Middle Ages. That, you are convinced there are witches. Well, then you look out and you find them. And here too, they were convinced that there were weapons of mass destruction. And therefore you were inclined to interpret anything as evidence of that.
Every year the United Nations said, stop, tell us what you're doing, and they did not. Well, finally, President Bush, Prime Minister Blair, and Mr. Berlusconi, Mr. Aznar, and many other leaders in the world said this has to come to an end.
The problem is you really shouldn't be going to war, a preemptive war, based on a suspicion or a belief. I mean, you should have some proof. I mean, there was no proof. That's the point.
This is clearly totally unsatisfactory, that the world's biggest governments can go ahead on the basis of such information.
I saw a former Jordanian prime minister for dinner, and I said, what if we don't find the weapons of mass destruction? And he said to me, you'd better invent them.
With Hans Blix out of the way, all that remained was to prove that Saddam Hussein had procured enriched uranium as part of a nuclear weapons program. But such accusations had to come from an irreproachable source. The White House put forward the name of Joe Wilson, a friend of the president's family. Wilson was the last American diplomat to have met Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. His courage during the Gulf War had led him to be decorated by the first President Bush. Dick Cheney asked the CIA to contact Wilson for a particularly delicate mission.
Joe Wilson was a very able ambassador, gave money to Bush 1. And Wilson was called by the CIA to go to a country whose people he knew and check out a rumor that the country of Niger had sold yellow cake, which is a material you'd use in part of nuclear weapons production, to Iraq. The neocons around President Bush, had been citing this, including Cheney, had been citing this as a reason to invade Iraq.
I told them when the decision was made that I would go, but only as a representative of the government. In other words, as someone who asks questions on behalf of the government, not for the CIA. I'm not a spy.
So he went and he talked to several government officials and asked them how they, what type of business they do with uranium, what are the safeguards, what are the protections, and came back and said that it was, in his view, unlikely that such a deal could happen.
I made my report that said no, there was no truth in it. There was nothing to the story.
To Wilson's great shock, even though he had learned that, the speech that the president gave in the State of the Union, which is the most important speech an American president can give, cited this thing, saying it was true.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
We knew from the reports that were made, including my own, that this information was false.
Bush is either a liar or he believes it and doesn't know it's not true. Either is bad. Either disqualifies Bush as president.
You can't say it was the British. It seems perfectly clear that it was someone within the White House who put something in his speech that couldn't be justified.
Well, Wilson was just appalled by it because he knew it wasn't true. The people at the CIA also knew it wasn't true.
They had told the White House before that this was wrong. This started a gigantic fight with CIA people leaking all over the place against the White House.
It's an issue on which they based the decision to go to war. Not only to war, but to wage a war that led to the invasion, the conquest, and now the occupation of a sovereign nation.
That's when Joe Wilson got very upset.
And so he decided to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times describing this experience he had. Well, the political people in the White House were angry. And the way they dealt with this is they decided to leak the story to 5 different organizations, all friendly news people that had dealt with them in the past. The one organization that took it was Robert Novak, the conservative columnist.
He calls one of his contacts at the White House. The White House is trying to diminish Joe Wilson and says, oh, and by the way, you know, his wife is with the CIA, and she's the one who had the idea of sending him to Niger.
And he ran the story mentioning Joe Wilson's wife's name, which is a federal crime. Joe Wilson's wife was a covert operative for the operations directorate of the CIA, and when you mention one of those names, mention a spy's name, you endanger her.
Look at what they did. They compromised everything she had done in the previous 20 years. Because it was not only the person, but her whole career that was called into question. All her relations with foreigners. Everything that she'd been able to achieve for her country since joining the CIA.
That's one of the worst things I've ever heard of anyone doing in the White House.
The story was ruining her career, but also undermining her work.
Every operation she was ever involved with, every country she ever visited, would now become the target of opposing forces in those countries. So a lot of people's lives were put in danger when he did that.
The idea of using a member of an opponent's family to try to discredit him or her, hoping to discredit the opponent at the same time, is totally idiotic. Ethically, it's intolerable.
The leak is now being investigated in this country, but it's believed to have come from somebody at the White House, either in the vice president's office or the president's office.
It's hard for me to believe that that would have been orchestrated by Bush.
I suspect that the President of the United States, the appointed President of the United States, is completely clueless about this and many other things. I believe that these individuals who worked for Dick Cheney, the FBI has now established who it was, they worked for Dick Cheney, and I believe that they acted independently perhaps of Cheney's guidance, but with his complete protection.
He was the one who asked for the report that I'd made. And he was with the president when we analyzed it and went over the State of the Union address. He's the one who's remained the most inflexible on the issue of nuclear weapons, even after receiving not only my report, but all the other reports. I therefore consider him to be dishonest in his speeches and in his efforts to alarm Americans and create a sort of climate of fear.
At the White House, George W., avoiding confrontation with journalists, remained desperately silent.
Remember to senior staff, how did the CIA operate, sir?
President Bush said nothing. He didn't address this. He didn't say, I'm outraged. This is terrible. He didn't say, I want an investigation. He didn't say to his staff, you tell me whether you did this or not. I want you to sign a piece of paper saying you didn't do it. I mean, he did nothing.
It's obvious that it was a pretext. They waged war on Baghdad to redraw the political map of the Middle East, pure and simple.
Congress was so subdued, one might be tempted to believe there was a one-party state. It was left to Robert Byrd, the oldest member of the Senate, to give one of the most violent speeches ever made against a sitting U.S. president. More surprisingly, Byrd was a personal friend of George Bush Sr. and of Ronald Reagan, but Byrd was 85 and had nothing to lose.
There's no debate. There's no discussion. There's nothing. Nothing. The idea that the United States or any other nation can legitimately attack a nation that is not imminently threatening, but which may be threatening in the future. The idea that the United States may attack a sovereign government because of a dislike for a particular regime is a radical new twist on the traditional idea of self-defense. This administration has turned the patient art of diplomacy on its head, turned the patient art of diplomacy into threats, labeling and name-calling of the sort that reflects quite poorly on the intelligence and sensitivity of our leaders and which will have consequences for years to come. Calling heads of states pygmies, labeling whole countries as evil, denigrating powerful European allies as irrelevant. In only the space of 2 short years, this reckless and arrogant administration has initiated policies which may reap disastrous consequences for years. Will we seize Iraq's oil fields? Becoming an occupying power which controls the price and supply of that nation's oil for the foreseeable future? There are some who think so. Frankly, many of the pronouncements made by this administration are outrageous. There's no other word. And yet this chamber is hauntingly silent. Silent.
Come out! Come out! Open the door! Open the door! Get your hands up and come outside! Come outside! Everybody in the house needs to come outside! Out here in the yard! Out here in the yard! Keep going! Keep going! Keep going! Keep going!
No one there! No one in there!
Good start, sir!
Yeah, clear the house now. Let's sweep on down straight.
Keep going.
The Center for Public Integrity is staffed by a handful of volunteers who've decided to raise the alarm about George W.'s reshaping of America in the name of the war on terrorism. And above all, about the loss of liberties that this involves. It was the center that revealed how Attorney General John Ashcroft was secretly preparing Patriot Act II, endowing the administration with powers of surveillance, not only of the country's borders and foreign citizens, but of Americans themselves.
This is our democracy, for God's sake. The Patriot II Act
Ashcroft and his aides kept that legislation from the public and from their own Republican chairmen of the Judiciary Committees in the House and Senate for half a year. They never told them they were planning new legislation. They never showed them the legislation. And when we obtained the legislation, everyone, including Republicans in Congress, were utterly astonished because no one told them.
It was simply just an internal circulation that was unfortunately disclosed in an unauthorized manner prematurely, really, to the public.
What is that about? When did we start developing secret legislation that changes our rights and liberties?
We're constantly challenging ourselves with ideas, some of them crazy, some of them stupid.
This is not the United States of America. There's something very odd. Whatever we think of the substance of that legislation, that's inappropriate.
We supervise a workforce of 168,000 persons. Some of those persons will make mistakes. USA Patriot Act 2 was more of a think piece.
Viet Dinh, who was sworn in the presence of President Bush, was entrusted with putting together this package of repressive measures, which would authorize unrestricted access to personal data and secret searches on private property, as well as extending secret telephone taps across the whole country.
This new law that I signed today will allow surveillance of all communications used by terrorists, including emails, the internet, and cell phones.
On peut demander à n'importe quelle bibliothèque publique.
They can ask any public library to provide the list of books borrowed by its readers.
Qu'empruntent leurs clients.
They simply get a subpoena from a criminal grand jury in order to obtain such records from businesses, including libraries and bookstores, if they have evidence relevant to a criminal investigation.
They can spy on anybody. They can get your phone records. They can get your credit card records. They can find your library books you read. They will go after you, and they do it. And they do it quite proudly.
Operation TIPS was organized offering a toll-free number that people could call 24/7 to report the suspicious behavior or subversive comments of their neighbors, friends, or relations under cover of anonymity. John Ashcroft declared, "We stood the system on its head, but maybe for good reasons. It was a national emergency."
People have an obligation to contribute to the protection of that freedom, of that security.
We are asking all U.S. citizens to come forward to the FBI with any valuable information they have to help us apprehend terrorists or to stop terrorist attacks.
The idea was that they were going to have mailmen, people who read meters for the electricity and the gas, anybody who sees anything that they think is suspicious, to call and report people into the government.
Because they know best who is out of place, who looks suspicious, and it is no more than simply a reporting of suspicious activity to the law enforcement authorities.
The last country that did this, that I know about, was the Soviet Union, where you had people that would, in your apartment block, who would rat on you if you had the wrong book, or if you had, and that's what they were trying to create here, and that's what TIPS was. When Americans start pointing the fingers at other Americans, saying you're no good, you're a communist, you're a red, you're this, you're that. Now it's you're an Arab, you're Al Qaeda, but whatever it is. When we start doing all this, we're kind of becoming what we're supposed to be fighting. You know, I mean, this is the kind of stuff the Taliban did. So now we're going to do it. We're going to say, well, we want to know what you read, we want to know what you do, we want to know what you say, what you buy, what you rent, who you see, who you have dinner with. This is not America.
They've got no Arab students there because they can't pass the visa exam. Friends of mine are being stopped at the border and asked to provide certificates from the police department that they're not criminals.
Three states and 235 cities announced that they would not apply these laws in their jurisdiction. They contested the new legislation, warned against the excesses of the war on terror, and accused the government of abusing its power. Dick Cheney was unabashed. The way I think of it is, it's a new normalcy. I think those will become permanent features in our way of life.
I am always constantly afraid of Big Brother, of George Orwell. Those kinds of activities can quickly turn ourselves into a Gestapo state.
Won't come easily to America, but it could come here. It could come here because fascism finally is the deterioration of democracy as well as the upsurge of an autocratic, oppressive notions of government. And it can come from either direction. Democracies can crumble, and oppressions can become so powerful that you can call them fascisms.
We are going after these people, and we are going to prevail in court, I hope, I believe, because they are hiding the truth.
The other major preoccupation of the center is the fight against corruption and the huge profits to be made from the war in Iraq.
Bush and Cheney are the first time that we've had two businessmen, two oil executives become president and vice president. This is utterly unprecedented in U.S. history. There are certain companies, dozens and dozens, hundreds of companies that are getting phenomenally, obscenely rich. And guess what? 2/3 to 3/4 of those companies give their campaign contributions to the Republican Party and to George W. Bush in incredible gratitude for this wonderful time they're having. And all of it is in the name of national security. And while we have a flag in the background and we put our hand over our heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance, we're getting rich.
This administration is behaving like pigs at the trough. They're saying, we want it all. We want to take it all. We went in there, we got them out, and we're now going to take all the business.
Dick Cheney said, well, you know, unfortunately, God put oil in certain countries, and you can't control that.
Vice President Dick Cheney was formerly president and CEO of Halliburton, the world leader in oil services. A Halliburton subsidiary was the first to offer George Bush Sr. a job in 1948. A recent article in the Washington Post revealed how Halliburton continued to trade with Iraq despite the embargo when Dick Cheney was CEO. A week before his inauguration as vice president, Dick Cheney left Halliburton with compensation of over $45 million in stock options.
This has been a bonanza period for the company. They're doing quite well, thank you very much. And having your former president and CEO as the vice president obviously has not hurt one bit.
Halliburton, Dick Cheney's company, effectively stole $61 million since April. I find that astonishing. And everybody knew it. Anybody who deals in Iraq knows that gasoline was being sold at enormous margins.
It seems to be that they bought the petrol for €1 and sold it for $3. It's outrageous.
Nobody had a chance to bid. And then we're told that Halliburton then, in turn, after it gets $600 million, will put up other contracts, subcontracts to bidding. So it struck us as a little dubious.
Well, I think this is part of a very small, organized mafia that is taking advantage of the American public.
Look, they're all crooks. You know, every contract in Iraq today is tailor-made for Kellogg Brown Root, which is Cheney's company, it's a subsidiary of Halliburton. You can't go into Iraq unless you deal with an American company.
The giant American arms firm Lockheed Martin possesses equally close relations with the Bush administration since the vice president's wife, Lynn Cheney, sits on its board.
Mrs. Cheney being on a corporate board of a company getting federal government contracts and not resigning immediately when her husband took power as vice president is highly unusual. In fact, I don't know of a single time in U.S. history, not in any recent half century that I'm of contemporary America, where the spouse of a vice president was getting money from a corporation getting government contracts. It's such an obvious conflict of interest. It is so obviously inappropriate. And what is most incredible to me is when news reports of that connection surfaced, she had a very defiant response. Basically, you can all go to hell. I will continue to serve on this board.
Like himself and his father, George W.'s closest advisors are totally bound to the arms and oil industries. Karl Rove, the foremost of the president's advisors, was a shareholder in Boeing, many of whose activities are in the military field. Boeing makes Apache helicopters, guided missiles, and Tomahawk cruise missiles. Paul Wolfowitz, number 2 at the Pentagon, charged consultancy fees to Northrop Grumman before joining the administration. Northrop Grumman makes F-18 fighter bombers, which have been massively used in Iraq. Donald Rumsfeld and Colin Powell were directors of Gulfstream Aerospace. They left the company with golden goodbyes of $1 million. Donald Rumsfeld also sat on the board of ABB, a company that sold nuclear reactors to North Korea. In March 2003, The New Yorker revealed that Richard Pearl was a partner in the company Trireme. While Pearl was at the Pentagon, Trireme turned over $45 million, of which more than half came from Boeing's military subsidiaries.
Come on, the guy writes an article in the Wall Street Journal, but forgets to tell the reader that he took $20 million for Boeing.
Clearly making money from his close association with the president. The president did not have any problem with this. He didn't rebuke Pearl publicly.
Well, it's starting to look like a third world republic, isn't it? Banana republic.
In 2 years, Northrop Grumman, the U.S. Air Force's leading supplier, has increased sales by 60%, Boeing by 30%, and Lockheed Martin by 25%. The very serious Los Angeles Times wrote, "No administration ever allowed herself a single tenth of what has occurred under George W. Bush. None."
Halliburton, Bechtel, Lockheed, Boeing. We know where this war is going. Halliburton, Bechtel, Lockheed, Boeing. We know where this war is going.
Multinational corporations have no ethics. They will deal with the devil himself if they can make a profit.
Bush, father and son, have not only dined with the devil, but have frequently invited themselves to his table.
You mind if I peek at some of the family photos?
There he is. Here's
right
his
there.
swearing in as the 41st president. And this is an interesting picture. This is 3 generations of Bushes: Senator Bush, President Bush, and President Bush.
Prescott Bush, George W.'s grandfather, enjoyed an illustrious banking career, became a respectable Republican senator, played golf with Eisenhower, until his past caught up with him.
Well, it's an interesting family. Prescott Bush was the grandfather, the patriarch of the family. And Prescott Bush in the 1940s had an interesting role. He was an investment banker for Brown Brothers Harriman. Unfortunately, at the very same time he was doing those things, he was the secret banker for Adolf Hitler and the Thyssen family. And he moved money for the Nazis. While his son was fighting them in the Pacific, fighting their allies in the Pacific, Dad was home doing that.
All of Prescott Bush's companies were taken over by the government due to their cooperation with the Third Reich and trading with the enemy. One of his companies operated mines in Poland, using the inmates of nearby concentration camps as forced labor.
About a week ago, the records showing Prescott Bush's connections to the Hitler government were released in the National Archives. Do you know there wasn't one story about that on any television network?
You know, I don't think the public really ever has looked that closely at the Bush family today or in the past.
10 years before the first Gulf War, George W.'s father, Ronald Reagan's vice president, had offered Iraq America's support in its war with Iran. Back then, George Bush and Saddam Hussein were the best of friends.
Well, I wouldn't have called him a friend in particular. We had relations with the Saddam Hussein regime, just like we've had relations with any number of tyrannical regimes around the world. We tried to moderate his behavior.
George Bush, when he was vice president of Ronald Reagan, actually set up Saddam Hussein, actually backed him, actually put him into power, and his envoy in all this was then in private citizen the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. He actually went to see Saddam and then came back and recommended we support him.
We created Saddam Hussein, just like we created bin Laden. The United States of America creates its own enemies.
It was blowing up in our face, and we didn't know it, and we were too stupid to see it. And that is the legacy of George Bush's father.
The idea was to keep the war going as long as possible so they would destroy each other. It was astonishingly cynical and Machiavellian.
There was some modest cooperation between the United States and the Saddam Hussein regime. It is simply not correct to say we gave them massive supply of weapons. We gave them some intelligence on order of battle information.
We were willing to give Saddam Hussein anything in the world to hurt the Iranians.
Bob Woodward of the Washington Post has revealed how the CIA supplied the Iraqis with satellite photos taken by U.S. spy planes. so that they might better target their bombing of Iranian troops. For over 4 years, Saddam had access to and developed knowledge of America's intelligence gathering methods.
The CIA helped the Iraqis by providing not satellite photography, I don't believe, but with the information off of satellite photography. Yes, the CIA cooperated with Saddam Hussein in 1984. We know that.
They did give satellite photography. I mean, it was the CIA that helped win the war for Saddam. They informed the Iraqis, the United States government, when there was going to be an attack.
We were providing direct intelligence support, including signals intercepts, not just imagery. And the bottom line is we chose to support Iraq over Iran, and we were willing to overlook genocide on Saddam's part.
The United States tilted a little bit toward Iraq. That is not a policy that I liked very much. I didn't participate in that policy.
George Bush Sr., as Reagan's vice president, armed and financed Saddam Hussein. In 1986, in a top-secret operation, strains of anthrax were sent to Iraq.
That we had given them anthrax? That's crazy. That's just absolutely untrue.
In fact, we prevented that. During the Reagan administration, the Pentagon stopped the shipment of anthrax. So, I mean, it may be that something or other got through, but policy was never to give any such thing to Iraq.
In October 1992, a Senate inquiry discovered that between 1985 and 1989, 60 deliveries of biological compounds were made to Saddam's military laboratories. The giant American building contractor Bechtel, now run by Reagan's former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, was chosen by the Iraqi authorities to build the factories that would enable Saddam to produce WMDs.
I remember it very well because I was writing about it in the newspaper at the time, criticizing Reagan and even more Bush, the father, for his administration helping Saddam Hussein after the use of chemical weapons against the Kurds. I thought it was clear what Saddam Hussein's intentions were and that we needed to oppose him, not help him. And Bush the father read those articles, denied them, has never forgiven me for writing them.
We were fully aware of it. Our ambassador knew it. Our military advisors to him knew it. Colin Powell, who was visiting, knew it. A number of people knew it. And we still supplied aid to him. So 10 years later to say that he's a terrorist, he's this guy and that, because he used poison gas, is absolutely disingenuous and ridiculous.
Sam Gwynn is the editor of the Texas Monthly. He published a series of articles and then a book about the Bush dynasty. 4 generations of business scandals, tight personal and financial networks handed down from father to son, George Bush Sr. doing business with the Bin Ladens, corrupt bankers. The Bushes are the first American political clan to be inextricably mixed up with the oil-rich royal families of the Middle East. Saudi princes, the Bin Ladens, and the Bushes have often been partners in business, and the family of the future terrorist leader indirectly funded the business and political career of George W. Bush.
I don't know if there's a Bush dynasty, but Bush and his son have been much too willing to sell out the American interest to those who pay them.
Well, for the father, the moment he left the White House, he goes off to Saudi Arabia to do business for the Carlyle Group, where he's a consultant.
It is what they call in America the revolving door in Washington, where you go, you know, you suddenly one day you're in the Defense Department, like Frank Carlucci, and then suddenly you're then out working for a company that has business with the Defense Department.
Carlyle is one of the biggest private equity houses in America, handling nearly $16 billion in investments. Founded and run by Frank Carlucci, Deputy Director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration, the majority of its senior staff are also ex-Pentagon, CIA, or White House. But Carlyle is much more than a simple investment fund. Today, the majority of its activities are linked to the defense sector. Its subsidiary, United Defense Industries, makes the tanks that are on the ground in Iraq and the missiles that are lying in readiness on America's warships.
And all we know is that people leave the government and for some reason they work for the Carlyle Group. But what value do they add? It's like the mafia, it's a small family, and Carlucci was the head of it.
There's nothing mysterious about Carlyle. We're a private equity house, basically owned by the partners, of which I am one. We invest in companies, we buy companies. We probably control 17 or 18 European companies, mainly in the engineering area.
And on the advisory board, you have George H.W. Bush. I don't know how we distinguish him, 41. H.W. Bush, James Baker, the former Secretary of State, Frank Carlucci. These people are all major Bush-era politicians.
Some of our companies do deal with government. We have a company that does security clearances for the Air Force. We have a company that builds some of the armored vehicles for the Army.
This is historically unprecedented. We have never had a former U.S. president helping a defense contractor during a time of war, and we've never had this odd circumstance of that happening while the former president's son is a sitting U.S. president. I mean, this is an extraordinary, utterly peculiar situation.
But they don't call it corruption, they call it business. Did you ever see The Godfather? It's just business.
At 9 a.m. on September 11, 2001, at Washington's Ritz-Carlton Hotel, the Carlyle Group's annual investors conference opened. The meeting was presided by Chairman Frank Carlucci. Beside him was Shafiq bin Laden, Osama's brother, who represents the bin Laden family within Carlyle.
You know, top officials from the former administrations, the Bush administration, were meeting with the Carlucci Group and bin Laden family on the 11th of September in a nice hotel. Everybody was friendly. They were talking about business.
Like everybody else who was an investor, they were entitled to attend the investor conference. It was entirely a matter of their choice.
So it's interesting at this, you have bin Laden. There's two bin Ladens, I guess.
It was a brother of bin Laden that was meeting with the Carlyle Group. Yeah, he was the head of the bin Laden Group.
Anybody who, as I say, who had invested in Carlyle was able to attend.
They were actually sitting there when the airplanes hit the World Trade Center and then shortly after the Pentagon.
It is correct that in September 11th of that year, we were having an investor conference when the attack on the World Trade Center took place.
My guess is that Carlyle has severed all its connections with the bin Laden family since September 11th. The problem is that at the highest levels of government, the implications of Saudi policy were not understood.
The Bush family's very good friend, Prince Bandar, their ambassador here, arranged for chartered planes, while no Americans were allowed to fly, to pick up all the members of the bin Laden family and other Saudis and take them home.
The only jet allowed to fly in the United States the day after 9/11. It picked up all of bin Laden's family members and flew them immediately to Saudi Arabia. I mean, if I were the US government, I would have let him pick up all of bin Laden's relatives, and then I would have put them immediately into detention and interrogated all of them.
We far too long accepted the Saudi version of reality that they sell to us and ignored what's really going on in that country.
The Saudis spend more money in Washington than almost any other government. They put the money around in law firms and lobbying groups, and they put the money into campaigns.
That paid for Colin Powell to go to Tufts University to give a speech for 15 minutes. And how much did he get for going to Boston? $200,000, plus a first-class ticket. You know, like the next week he became Secretary of State. That was Saudi money.
We have essentially been whores, political whores, for the Saudis for the last 40 years.
This is a country that has been buying off people for years. They buy off people, they buy off lobbyists and lawyers on K Street here in Washington. They buy off politicians by hiring them as advisors, by investing in their children's companies as they did with the Bush family.
George W. Bush, the President of the United States, was saved by Saudi Arabia on several occasions.
If they made direct investments in U.S. political campaigns, that's illegal. So they have to find intermediaries to do that with.
We have allowed the Saudis, in the name of cheap oil, to rape and cheat and deceive the American public.
You know, when you have this sort of dependence on money, it's very difficult as any dependence to criticize, the source of your money.
The shadowy links between the United States and Saudi Arabia were clearly set out by a Frenchman, Laurent Moraviec, in a meeting held behind closed doors at the heart of the American defense community, the Pentagon. This out-and-out hawk, former advisor to the French Defense Ministry, is a close friend of Richard Pearl.
Richard
Pearl invited me to come and make a report to the Defense Policy Board to launch an internal debate within the administration on Saudi Arabia. I was extremely honored that my adopted country should ask me, a Frenchman, to come to the Pentagon to participate in the development of U.S. policy.
It created a bit of an explosion when there were newspaper accounts of what had been said in that briefing.
There was a leak. The contents of my report appeared on the front page of the Washington Post, causing a huge scandal because the Saudi issue had been taboo up until then.
Moraviec's report was anything but politically correct. He put the unthinkable down in writing. The tone was brutal, the analysis extremely harsh towards the Saudi regime. It read as follows: Saudi Arabia is the kernel of evil, the most dangerous opponent in the Middle East. Saudis are active at every level of the terror chain, from planners to financiers to operatives. The Saudis are in fact no more than a sub-tribe, primeval brutes who procreate like rabbits.
I spoke of Saudi princes proliferating like rabbits in Australia. After all, there are around 8,000 Saudi princes today.
The portrayal he gave of Saudi Arabia was totally erroneous. But he made it clear that he was speaking as an individual. It was not a RAND position.
But because it was said in a meeting of Defense Department advisors, it created a big explosion.
His subsequent behavior led to a determination by RAND that his services were no longer needed.
Why? Because within the White House, and gravitating around it, are people who belong to what I call the Saudi lobby, the most powerful foreign lobby in Washington. And they are the people that President Bush has inherited, in particular from his father, and who continue to wield a certain amount of influence within the administration. In particular at the State Department, whose head, Colin Powell, is also part of the Saudi lobby.
George W. hurriedly apologized to the Saudi Crown Prince. This report does not represent views held by myself, the Secretary of Defense, or the Vice President.
Bush called Crown Prince Abdallah, and I lost my job. I was told that basically Carlucci had demanded my head.
I did speak to the president of RAND Corporation, but the RAND Corporation conducted its own investigation and made its own determination.
After an inquiry lasting 2 years, the report into intelligence failures and 9/11 was published by Congress. It included scathing criticisms of the administration, but the report was truncated of anything that touched on the links between the attackers and Saudi Arabia. Around 30 pages, classified as top secret, were lost.
Well, it wasn't lost, it was withheld by the executive branch, and I think probably because it would have revealed some things that are very embarrassing about Saudi Arabia.
The 28 pages in the congressional report on intelligence and September 11th were removed from the report or whitewashed within the report at the request of the executive.
I mean, I think that's all you need to know. I mean, I think the American public pretty much figured out the Saudis. Now, President Bush has defended them. What he's saying is they're our allies, and that everything's fine, and they're helping in the war against terrorism. The fact is, he invaded the wrong country. If he wanted to fight the war on terrorism, he should have invaded Saudi Arabia, not Iraq. That's not where the war is, and that's not who funded terrorists. It's take the attention away from what really is the cause of these events and put them on Saddam Hussein. It was a diversion. Everything has been a diversion.
A week before Christmas, George Bush received the gift he had almost given up on. All the media in America, radio, TV, and press, towed the Bush administration's line. The PR companies working for the Pentagon and the White House had earned their fees. The machine was up and running. A very rare exception was a radio station in Los Angeles which mused, "If information is the oxygen of democracy, the United States has just been gassed."
That was the right thing to do. Hussein is gone. A dictator is gone.
Yeah, but where is the anthrax? Where are the nuclear bunkers? Where are all this stuff? They were wrong, but they can't admit it.
The reality is he fooled us. He suckered us into a war in the Middle East based on very poor intelligence when there was no intelligence showing that they had weapons of mass destruction.
All these things that the CIA, that Colin Powell cited in his UN speech, these giant trucks moving around to these huge mobile weapons facilities, well, no one's found them.
If you ask the neocons, who said that they're weapons of mass destruction, Saddam was going to launch a nuclear war and all the rest of this stuff, they will tell you it doesn't matter. It was the morally right thing to do to go in. He was a bad guy.
Does anyone believe that we would never have seen weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam Hussein if we had left him in place? I certainly don't.
This war was stupid. They wrote articles about it. You have the generals from the first Gulf War wrote articles about it. You have other generals. The Pentagon hates the war, the generals do. The soldiers do. It was all driven by the hawks, who are incapable of telling the truth.
Nobody would ask us to stand there and accept a strike that we knew was coming, particularly if it involved a nuclear weapon or a chemical or a biological weapon.
I don't think he realizes how unpopular America has become around the world. I really don't.
I realized better than most people what this war would involve. I think most people thought there would be tens of thousands of people killed, and it would be a long and very bloody war. I thought it would be over in 3 weeks with very few people killed. Now, who was right?
"700 dead and over 3,000 wounded. But the American media has followed instructions and no longer mentions the casualties. The press have been banned from the air bases where the body bags arrive every day. The soldiers' funerals are no longer covered by television.
We're losing, a dozen Americans a week. And I'll tell you, if you drive up to Walter Reed Army Hospital and walk through the aisles up in Walter Reed Army Hospital and look at the kids who've lost arms, legs, who can't see anymore, who lost the lower half of their body, you'll understand what George Bush's war means.
Now, is that price worth paying to get rid of Saddam? And I say no, as bad as he was. I always said along, let the Iraqis find somebody else to replace him, somebody they can live with.
Now, there are some who say, turn sovereignty over right away. Well, to whom? And what power? Who would I turn it over to if I was going to go to Baghdad today and say, I'm turning over all sovereignty?
That was where the greatest folly was in the war. Democracy comes out of an inner impulse in a majority of the people in that country, one way or another, to change the way they live and have a more open and dignified life. You kind of bring it to them from outside.
The hawks will say if you turn the table over, it's good. You have democracy, you have civil societies, everybody will be happier, they'll accept Israel. They're pessimists like me, saying you turn the table over and you get something much worse.
Neither Cheney, nor Pearl, nor Wolfowitz, nor Rumsfeld understood that 80% of that country is aligned with Iran, and that if we allowed free and democratic elections, we would get an Islamic republic.
I mean, the abysmal ignorance in this administration of the region is one of the most frightening things I've ever seen.
They don't deserve democracy by their own light. Indeed, they don't. They haven't fought for the democracy. In the case of Iraq, the only way a democracy could have come to that country is through a basic war against Saddam Hussein that they were able to win, which they've not been able to.
The way I look at it today is this war was unjustified. It wasn't justified in their eyes. It was a war against Arabs, against Muslims. And so that will be a huge pool of recruits for bin Laden.
If they don't know that going into it, you have to ask yourself, are these people qualified to manage the American Republic?
I think we will probably be looking at this history in a very dark way 4, 5, 10 years down the road.
Crawford, Texas is where George W. has his family ranch. Crawford is a village with a population of 500. It has one street, like in the Western movies. George W.'s arrival here marked the beginning of a renaissance. The stores in the village, less than a dozen in all, are now souvenir shops selling presidential memorabilia, alongside Bibles and shotguns and all sorts of gadgets with his picture on, which, it is hoped, will pave the way for the president's re-election.
George Bush truly does not realize the magnitude of his mistakes. He has been completely captured by his base, the neoconservatives, the evangelical Christians, and his big business campaign contributors.
This president has more money than God. I mean, we are seeing more money in the political process by one candidate than any time in U.S. history.
He's going to have $200 million to spend on the election cycle. His closest Democrat now has raised about $15 million. So you can see the disparity.
On the other hand, if casualties have mounted, we've had a mini Tet offensive in Baghdad in the middle of the presidential campaign, then it could look very bad for President Bush.
Defeat in Iraq will be a terrible historical and political defeat for George W. Bush personally.
If the resistance gets much worse, which they expect it to get much worse, what we should be doing is counting the number of body bags, how many dead Americans are coming back.
Several hundred Americans have lost their life there, and it doesn't look like Iraq is turning around. The American public is going to be, I think, skeptical about giving Bush another 4 years.
Every president is at risk in the United States. If you lose the confidence of the public, you go home.
Yeah, he could lose. He could lose. Let's hope.
In early January 2004, the edifice carefully constructed by the White House began to crack. Faced with a tenacious reporter, George W. Bush finally admitted what he'd always denied.
We've had no evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved with the September the 11th.
In mid-January, Paul O'Neill, the president's former Treasury Secretary, published a book in which he revealed that the war had been planned well before 9/11. In his book, he describes George W. as a blind man in a room full of deaf people. O'Neill is to be charged with leaking a document dated February 2001 to the press, Plan for Post-Saddam Iraq. A few days later, David Kay, who'd headed the team looking for WMD in Iraq, returned to Washington empty-handed. Along with 1,400 weapons inspectors, he had spent 8 months searching vast tracts of Iraqi desert in vain. There was no sign the WMD ever existed.
I wanted to call them and ask them if they'd tell me exactly where they were, since they seemed to be much more sure about their existence than those of us who were searching.
On January 20th, 2004, Bush gave his State of the Union address, relying on David Kay's findings to lend weight to his assertions.
Already, the Kay report identified dozens of weapons of mass destruction-related program activities. Had we failed to act, the dictator's weapons of mass destruction programs would continue to this day. For all who love freedom and peace, the world without Saddam Hussein's regime is a better and safer place.
I resigned essentially one day after the State of the Union address. I thought the politicians should have been far more cautious about what they were saying. He should have said, in my view, we were wrong. He didn't. There is an obligation to frankly acknowledge error. All the Iraqis we were talking to, despite the fact that I had millions of dollars I could have rewarded them with, I could have provided them a palatial living place in the United States if they had taken us to weapons of mass destruction. In spite of all these incentives, no Iraqi had a story that said they had weapons or they had ever had weapons. We were all manipulated by Saddam Hussein. And I include myself during my days as inspector. I think he was bluffing. It turned out we were almost all wrong in terms of his actually having weapons. Most of his weapon stockpile, the pre-91, had been destroyed during the 90s. There is no evidence that he recreated large stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, and his nuclear program was a very pale shadow of a large program in the 1980s. It almost didn't exist. The April 5th speech of Secretary Powell really looks a bit ridiculous now in terms of what we found.
David Kay's resignation in mid-election campaign came as a bombshell. In late January, Colin Powell said, "If I had known what David Kay told the Senate, my advice to the president would not have been to engage hostilities. On February 5th, the CIA Director George Tenet commented publicly for the first time, "We may have overestimated the progress Saddam was making. Our officers never said there was an imminent threat."
The worst thing for a democracy is to suppress the truth in the interest of the election. The idea of preemptive military action every time you have a threat is a genuinely crazy idea. We went to war for the wrong reasons on the basis of a serious deception and error.
George W. Bush eventually agreed to set up an independent commission of inquiry into the existence of WMDs, which had been the backbone of Washington's justification for the war against Iraq. But the commission is due to report in 2005, after November's presidential elections.
Take away our PlayStations, and we are a third world nation under the thumb of some blue blood royal son who stole the Oval Office and that phony election. I mean, it don't take a weatherman to look around and see the weather. Jeb said he'd deliver Florida, folks, and boy, did he ever. And we hold these truths to be self-evident. Number one, George W. Bush is not president. Number two, America is not a true democracy. And number three, the media is not fooling me, 'cause I'm a poem heating hyperdistillation, and I've got no room for a lie so verbose. Yeah. Yes, I'm looking out over my whole human family, and I'm raising my glass in a toast. Here's to our last drink of fossil fuels. Give back the night its distant whistle. Give the darkness back its soul. Give the big oil companies the finger finally, and relearn how to rock and roll. Yes, the lessons are all around us, and the truth is waiting there. It's time to pick through the rubble, clean the streets, and clear the air. Get our government to pull its big dick out of the sand of someone else's desert. Put it back in his pants. Quit the hypocritical chants of freedom forever. 'Cause when one lone phone rang in 2001 at 10 after 9 on 911, which was the number we all call when that lone phone rang right off the wall, right off our desk and down the long hall, down the long stairs in a building so tall that the whole world turned just to watch it fall.